Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, commercial ships have been under attack from Houthi rebels based in Yemen for weeks. We talk to experts on who they are and what's being learned from the attacks. And coverage from the Surface Navy Association's annual symposium. We were on the scene to find out about the latest topics and bring you highlights from the show floor. Hear from our reporter on what officials were talking about most. Plus, the Secretary of Defense drops off the radar for days while he was in the hospital. We have analysis on the continued fallout of how Secretary Lloyd Austin went into intensive care without informing the White House or Congress. There's a lot on deck this week, so don't go anywhere. It's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon on this episode of Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Colin Demarest. Since the Israeli military's advance into Gaza following the October 7th attack by the Palestinian militant group Hamas, Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have been launching a steady stream of missiles and attack drones on commercial ships in the Red Sea. U.S. Navy destroyers have taken out dozens of those drones and missiles in recent months, and in one instance sank several small boats during an attempted hijacking of a commercial vessel, according to U.S. Central Command. But who are the Houthis? Where are they getting their weapons? And what is the U.S. Navy learning from these engagements? We talked to a range of experts about the latest unrest in the region to find out. First up, Nick Carl from the American Enterprise Institute joined us to discuss the group and the greater implications of the recent attacks.
Nick, for the past few weeks or even months, Houthi rebels in Yemen have been intercepting cargo containers that they say are affiliated with Israel in one way or another, and it seems to be that they are responding to the situation, the war in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, and ultimately the United States got involved in different countries got involved in Operation Prosperity Guardian, which in its name is, trying to protect the commerce that goes through the Red Sea, and there's so much money being lost with different countries that traverse that area. And I think what the Houthi rebels are doing is trying to hit everyone in their pocketbooks to perhaps affect some change in Israel. I want to kind of just start from the basics. Who are the Houthi rebels?
The Houthi rebels are a militia movement that has been fighting a civil war in Yemen now for the past several years. The civil war kicked off back in September of 2014 when the Houthis captured the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. Since then, they have fought a bloody conflict against all different sorts of factions throughout Yemen. And throughout this conflict, they have received all sorts of arms, financing, and military advice from Iran. Iran has proven to be one of the most prominent military backers to the Houthis and is a large reason why the Houthis have the military capabilities to currently threaten commercial traffic around the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
And that's because they're being financed and supplied by Iran, which is essentially the financier of many of their operations, right? So weapons, vehicles, and that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's important not to overstate the degree to which Iran directly controls the Houthis. The Houthis are part of what the Iranians will often describe as their axis of resistance. This term, axis of resistance, is the language the Iranian leaders use to describe their unconventional alliance structure throughout the Middle East. And it's comprised of various state, semi-state, and non-state actors. So some of these groups include Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, myriad other militia groups running around in Iraq, Syria, the Palestinian territories. And of course, the Houthis are part of this axis of resistance. Now, the Houthis are not a direct proxy in the same way that you might think of the Iranian relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. But nevertheless, the Houthis have demonstrated time and time again that they are, at least to some degree, receptive to Iranian influence. And that influence is in part bought by the provision of Iranian arms and financial support to the Houthi movement.
And Nick, when it comes to Iran, you hear their name pop up all over the place, right? In Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, several other places. Their name's always there. We rarely, if ever, really see Iranian troops really anywhere. It seems like they have, their own influence throughout the region. But what's the ultimate goal there?
Yeah, that actually speaks, I think, to the strategic rationale that motivates Iran to build out its axis of resistance throughout the Middle East. One of the sort of defining traits of the axis of resistance is that many of its members subscribe to a very similar set of ideological principles, namely anti-United States and anti-Israel sentiments. These are some of the core drivers of the cooperation across all sorts of different members of the axis of resistance in the Middle East. This ideological unity creates this kind of strategic alignment. And so that is some of the common ground that has allowed the Iranian partnership with the Houthi movement to develop. So, as I said, the purpose of this unconventional alliance is to help Iran attain what are essentially its grand strategic objectives within the Middle East. These objectives are attaining regional hegemony, destroying the Israeli state, and ultimately expelling American influence from the Middle East. And that latter objective is primarily taking the form of Iran currently working to expel U.S. forces currently deployed in Iraq and Syria. The axis of resistance is now demonstrating its capability and readiness to imperil global traffic that is flowing through these absolutely crucial arteries for global trade.
Would the Houthi rebels themselves, with what they're doing, be able to influence policy, American policy, Israeli policy in the Middle East, influence the outcome of the war or the way it's being carried out?
The Houthis are framing this as directly related to the Israel-Hamas war, but the end of this war is not going to change the fact that Iran and the Houthis remain committed to trying to manipulate their proximity to these strategic choke points in order to achieve their international objectives, right? These are key pressure points that they have regularly leveraged historically, and they will almost certainly continue to do so in the future, regardless of what is going on between Israel and the Gaza Strip.
So, Nick, if there is a resolution to the war in Israel that would satisfy, the average Houthi rebel and their command, would the threat to shipping stop?
No, unfortunately, it would not. Iran and its axis of resistance, that includes the Houthis, have threatened and attacked international shipping around the Middle East for many years now. This is a phenomenon that well precedes the war that's presently occurring between Israel and Hamas, and we therefore should not operate under any expectation that a resolution to the war is going to fix the problems that we face outside of Israel and the Gaza Strip. The Houthis remain committed to trying to demonstrate to the Middle East and the world the degree to which they are prepared and able to threaten and attack international shipping. And they're going to continually use their capabilities and proximity to the Red Sea as a means of pressure against their adversaries throughout the world.
All right, Nick Carl from the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Next, Navy Times editor Jeff Zazulowicz has been talking to officials about the unprecedented nature of the U.S. Navy's fight in the Red Sea and what the force is taking away from the recent events there.
So what the Navy destroyers in the Red Sea are facing is pretty unprecedented in modern Navy history. Some retired Navy officers I spoke with said the closest precedent might be fire support missions that the Navy conducted during the Vietnam War. And we have seen the Navy in the Red Sea and in the region in the past dealing with harassing attacks by Houthi rebels or other Iranian allied elements. But most retired and active duty officers I've been speaking with indicate that these are pretty uncharted waters, so to speak, in the Red Sea. When it comes to what destroyers like the Carney, the Gravely, the Mason, the Laboon are doing in terms of intercepting Houthi weapons, Navy leaders tell us they feel pretty good about their existing munitions stockpiles. There has been some discussion about using the relatively expensive SM-2 missile to shoot down relatively inexpensive Iranian-made attack drones being fired by the Houthis. But for now, at least, some admirals we've spoken to indicate that they feel good about their stockpiles. In addition, the head of Naval Surface Forces, Vice Admiral Brendan McLean, recently bemoaned the lack of shipboard lasers on Navy destroyers. He seemed to indicate that this would be a really good weapon system to have in the Red Sea at this moment as these engagements continue.
One of the things that I think we really need to get after quicker is we need to accelerate the development of, directed energy weapons, whether it's a laser, whether it's a microwave. When I was in Bahrain as Gastron 50 10 years ago, the afloat staging base, Ponce, had a laser on it. And we're 10 years down the road and we still don't have something that we can field. I mean, I find that frustrating. And I really want to put a lot of effort into to accelerating that, because that gives you so much when it comes to magazine capacity and speed and distance.
In terms of lessons learned, Vice Admiral McLean and other Navy leaders say that in real time, the surface fleet's weapons tactics instructors are parsing data from the ships. They're learning lessons about how to tune their radars for these engagements in that kind of narrow, shallow bathtub that is the Red Sea.
We have our warfare tactics instructors involved in analyzing the data that we're getting from the tapes on Carney and the other ships, and we're looking very closely at the profiles and what we have to do when it comes to radar tuning, and what we have to do when it comes to setting up our weapon systems on the ship to make sure that we have maximum defensive capability at all times.
And another angle on this topic. I've been doing some reporting of my own on how Iranian tech has driven many of the attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, a vital economic shipping lane. Experts I interviewed, including Brian Clark with the Hudson Institute, said the rebels are using Iranian technology and its derivatives. The regime in Tehran has long supported a constellation of combatants in advancement of its own goals. Iranian drones, for example, were recently recovered in both Ukraine after Russian use and Iraq, according to the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. The weapons at Houthi disposal include one-way attack drones, strikingly similar to Iran's Shahed-136, anti-ship ballistic missiles, and unmanned surface vessels, or USVs, which are packed with explosives and sent into the water to detonate near a target. The U.S. Navy earlier this month took credit for downing more than 60 missiles and drones, including a flock of the latter encountered by the guided missile destroyer USS Carney on December 16th. At the service's disposal are an array of weapons, the Standard Missile 2, or SM-2, and the 5-inch gun among them. But cost is a concern. Is using a multi-million-dollar missile on a $1,000 drone sustainable? I'll be watching this closely, and you can find further reporting on C4ISRnet. For a look at what some of that Iranian technology actually looks like, here's an archival piece from 2017 when the Trump administration put a bunch of captured Iranian weapons tech on display for the media. Check it out.
It's no secret that Iran is covertly arming fighters in several different conflicts. But what we have here in this warehouse in Washington, D.C. is evidence. I'll show you several different weapons, and I'll point out exactly how DoD experts have acted as detectives to trace these weapons back to Iran. These are the remains of 2 Qayyam missiles, and one of them actually flew into Riyadh in December. You may have seen that on the news. I'm going to start from here on the top to show you these valves, which are in a specific pattern that American experts recognize to be Iranian. The Qayyam doesn't have fin stabilizers, which is a dead giveaway right off the bat, but also these wind bolt covers. As you can see on the diagram, there are 3 bolts, and even with all this wreckage, experts can point them out. 1, 2, and 3. Defense officials believe this missile was disassembled, smuggled into Saudi Arabia, and reassembled in the field right before it was launched. And what's the dead giveaway? Well, right here you see this really nice factory welding, and over here, this is field welding. It looks a lot different. And now we're here at the navigation system, which is the brains of the missile. There are some dead giveaways, specifically markings from companies that work directly under the Iranian Ministry of Defense. And like any good industrial producer, they leave their markings, they leave their brand on the circuit board. And even better, there's a quality control sticker in the back that's dated 2015. That blast was made with a semi-autonomous boat that has a warhead inside of it. Now, the boat is not remarkable in and of itself, but here we have the guts. That's the guidance computer. In a dead giveaway, you don't have to be a genius to figure this one out. The keyboard's in Farsi. And inside of the casing is two brains. This is an actual computer on this side, and on this side, this is what controls the autonomous vehicle. And back here, this is the camera that guides it. It's an off-the-shelf camera. The Department of Defense wants this information out there. In fact, they've had representatives from more than 60 countries tour the artifacts. You might be wondering why Iranian manufacturers stamp their names on the products. One defense official told us that it's common practice, but he'll be curious to see if it keeps on happening in the future. Reporting from Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, I'm Daniel Woolfolk.
And when we come back, the latest from the Surface Navy Association's recent conference. Welcome back. At the Surface Navy Association's annual symposium in Washington, D.C., the theme this year was The Fight, the Force, the Future. Featuring scores of vendors with next-generation tech on display and some of the Navy's top leaders, it was a melting pot of the biggest topics facing the Surface Navy today. We caught up with reporter Megan Eckstein at the event to hear about the big themes and checked out some of what was on display on the show floor. Have a look.
I'm here at the Surface Navy Association's annual symposium, and top community leaders are here with different ways of expressing one main theme, which is that the Navy needs to maximize the ships that it has available. New Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, had an interesting way of putting it. She talks about putting more players on the field. This isn't to say the Navy needs to build more ships, but rather it needs to maximize the ones that it has. It needs to get ships out of construction faster. It needs to get ships out of maintenance faster. It needs to get ships through training faster. That way everyone is available to go to the fight if called upon. We heard a similar sentiment from SWOBOS, the Chief of Surface Forces, Vice Admiral Brendan McLean, and his way of talking about this was 75 mission-capable surface ships. The idea is that these 75 ships would be able to scramble into battle if called upon. So again, similar to the Chief of Naval Operations, this means having high levels of training, high levels of maintenance being completed, and just really ensuring that they're ready. That way, if something happens, they're ready to go. And finally, the commander of U.S. Fleet Forces Command, Admiral Daryl Cottle, talked about the fleet in three ways. He said there's about 100 ships today that are in depot maintenance and will not be able to go to the fight. There's another 100 that are already deployed and therefore are tied up. So there's about 100 left, and those are the ones that he really wants to focus on. Obviously, ship maintenance is a big concern of his, but he said even though there's progress being made there, he wants to double down on training. He wants to get ships through training faster. That way, if there's an emergency, those ships are trained and ready to go out to the fight as quick as possible. So we're hearing from all the surface community leaders different ways of looking at the same problem, but the ultimate goal is get maintenance done faster, get training done faster. That way these ships can go if called upon. Another topic that's come up in several different panels here at the Surface Navy Association conference is directed energy. Obviously, there's a number of destroyers in the Red Sea today that are shooting down Houthi missiles, Houthi drones, and they're using very expensive defensive missiles to do that. The Navy would love to transition to laser weapons. That way, for a much lower price, they can have these successful engagements. Vice Admiral Brendan McLean said he was disappointed the Navy doesn't have access to these yet, even though there are several laser weapons that are on ships as prototypes. The USS Preble is testing one, but it's not one of the ships that's in the Middle East right now on deployment. He said he'd much rather see laser weapons have their technology development accelerated. He wants to see them out on ships for experimentation. A few other speakers actually touched on this, including Rear Admiral Fred Pyle, who's the Director of Surface Warfare at the Pentagon. He really spoke about the need to also continue accelerating the investment to the greatest extent he can within his responsibility as funding the surface force. So hopefully by this time next year, we might see some movement with so many of the community leaders really pushing to bring this technology to ships as quickly as possible because we have an operational imperative to do so.
Welcome back. One of your goals for 2024 might be to get rid of that looming student loan. But how to get it done? On this edition of Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack gives some tips on how to tackle such a big task.
According to educationdata.com, the average student loan payment is just over $500 a month.
And with the changes to repayment options and a tight economy, a lot of families are concerned about how to manage student debt. The new year offers a fresh start and alternatives. The kind of loan you have affects your options. Typically, federal loans have lower interest rates than private loans, so most folks opt to refinance their private student loans. If you have multiple loans, look into consolidating them to make things more manageable. Shop banks and credit unions to get the best rate. For federal loans, studentaid.gov has tons of resources and tools that can compare different repayment plans. There are some new options that may even allow you to pay very little to $0 a month, depending on your finances. Finally, be careful online. If an offer seems too good to be true, it probably is. Stick to trusted resources and to your plan, and you'll conquer student debt.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, mount your robot goat and steer it toward militarytimes.com, as well as defensenews.com, and my corner of the intersphere, I swear that's what it's called, c4isrnet.com. And to stay a step ahead of your commanding officer on news and events, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the latest headlines. It's also in audio. Check out the podcast version, out each weekday. And the social media is where you collect your daily intelligence. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and X, Twitter. And like most junior service members, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. Next up, the lack of disclosure from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's office about his recent hospitalization has triggered a wave of criticism since it was revealed that not even the White House was aware he was in intensive care. For a look at the continued fallout from the gap in communication on the DoD's part, we head to the Pentagon to talk to Bureau Chief Megan Myers.
Secretary Austin has been hospitalized at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center since January 1st. He went in because of some complications he had following a surgery. We found out more than a week into his hospitalization that the surgery was for prostate cancer that was diagnosed in early December. He had a procedure on December 22nd to treat it, and then went into the hospital on New Year's Day complaining of abdominal hip pain. Where he was diagnosed with a urinary tract infection that he has since been in the hospital being treated for. So Secretary Austin went into the hospital via ambulance on New Year's Day. The following day, his chief of staff was notified that he was in the hospital, but she herself was sick at home with the flu. And so the Pentagon has said that that is the reason that it took 2 days for her to notify the White House that the Secretary of Defense was hospitalized, and then the following day Congress was notified, and then a few hours later the Pentagon put out a public statement. Part of the reason that all of this has created so much uproar is that several days delay in notification time for even the president, let alone the rest of the American public, but also because Austin did not originally disclose his cancer diagnosis to the president back in early December when he first got it. So there's been several different layers of fallout. Within the Pentagon, there's now an Office of the Secretary of Defense review of not only this particular situation, but the procedures that should be carried out when the Secretary of Defense is incapacitated, how his deputies should be notified, how the President and Congress should be notified. The Pentagon's Inspector General also announced that they're going to do their own review of the situation. And then there's even more fallout on Capitol Hill. Congressional Republicans have called for his resignation, have called for an impeachment, and are continuing to voice their concerns. So initially the White House was very supportive. The president said that he had spoken to the defense secretary and was looking forward to him getting back to work. Later on, it came out that not only, had the defense secretary not told the president that he was in the hospital, but he also hadn't told him that he had cancer at all. And so the national security spokesman, John Kirby, had said recently that it was not the ideal way to find out all of this health information about Secretary Austin, that they would have probably preferred to get a private notification. So Secretary Austin's prognosis is good. His cancer prognosis is good, also recovering from this infection. He's expected to make a full recovery. The Pentagon hasn't said anything specific about when he will be back in the building or whether this is going to affect any of the travel that he might have scheduled, but they're not making any sort of determinations at this point, whether he's going to be back soon or whether this is going to take a longer time, only that he's expected to fully recover. Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks is doing some of Austin's duties in the building, but technically Austin has full control over the chain of command from his hospital room at Walter Reed.
And that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next week.